Making a purchase requisition should ideally be the first step in a P2P process. The purchase requisition has to be created by the user, where the ultimate products end up with and being consumed. So it's not as if exactly every time a product is needed, a user is expected to create a requisition. It can be automated. So, for example, in a case of raw materials, where the purchased raw material requirement comes from the explosion of a bomb and running of an MRP, where in that case, the planner creates a planned order release, and based on that, it is converted into purchase order by the purchasing function. In some other cases, it could be inventory driven. So, for example, in MRO products, maintenance, repairs, and operating supplies, some organizations could have a min max policy. So, as soon as the min trigger is hit, an automatic requisition is generated, which goes to the purchasing function to generate a PO. And in all other cases, it could be need driven. So, whenever a user department needs something, requisition is actually generated by the user. Again, this is a little bit of a manual process, but it could be done via a system, and it does not have to be a paper based form that a user fills. So that is how a purchase requisition, like we said, always generated by the user. And in a way, this there is a separate process sometimes for creating of a requisition. So, for example, requisitions are a signal that the department or the user function has approved the purchase. So, somebody should authorize it. So there could be a separate detailed process depending on the type of product. So raw material, the authorization could be a release signal from the planner. In some other cases, the departments would have an internal process where some executive creates a requisition. It has to go to the department head, who then signs off the requisition before it is transferred to the purchasing. But every requisition has to have some policy of approval based on which it is created and then transferred to the purchasing department. And given that the requisition actually starts the purchasing process, and in some organizations, requisition means that the purchase is approved, um, it has to have very specific constructions. So, for example, it has to have the identity of the originator and the originating function, and also the basis for approval. So, in many cases, there are mentions to the budget item under which the requisition is approved and accounted for. It also has to have material specifications. In many cases, businesses don't allow users to specify a brand. Again, this is not 100%, but as a practice, users are allowed to specify functions, specification, capabilities, but not the brand. This is primarily done again to avoid undue bias from suppliers who could talk to users directly and create a requirement for their product. So users, like I said, are allowed to create specifications, capabilities, etc., but not the brand. Quantity, unit of measure, very important, because the wrong unit of measure, kilograms, pounds, etc., could create wrong quantities of material supplied. And of course, the required date and location of the product. So, a business may have three factories, or something is required for some other location. Well, in that case, a clear indication has to be made in the requisition. Now, here many times, especially for routinely required products, there is the material master. So, where the details of all the materials are present, including unit of measure, etc. So ideally, we would want users to reference that material master and get the data from there rather than recreate data. So two things happen. Whenever data is recreated every time, it makes it very difficult to analyze that data. So, for example, the same material may have been referenced in multiple different names. So at the end of the year, whenever I want to do an analysis of, well, how many of these kind of widgets have been ordered for the business, it's impossible for me to know because the same widget would have been ordered under three different names. And that is where this idea of using standard references is very useful. And of course, there are many different types of requisitions. I've just listed a few here. And again, a business can define their specific type of requisition. So, first is a standard where we want something, it's a raw material requirement or anything, it's a standard requisition. Second is a subcontract requisition. Well, in that case, the material has to be delivered to a supplier. So I have a supplier who assembles engines for me, and I need to ensure that all the components required for the engines, the casting, the piston rings, etc., are transferred or sent to this assembly supplier. And so what the purchasing expect is expected to do is to talk to tier 2, buy all the required material, and then send all the required material to tier 1, who would then assemble it into the complete product and send it to the buying company. So this is what is known as subcontract type of requisition, because the location of delivery is the supplier. Third is the consignment. So, in typical arrangements like VMI, vendor managed inventory, where the supplier stores the product in at buyer's facility, and a buyer pays it X days after usage. So now that product, which is already at the buyer's facility, has to be consumed and used up. And the buyer cannot just pick up the material from the stores, because the ownership of that material, though it's in the buyer stores, is for the supplier owns it. So in that case, the buyer could, or some user from the buying company could issue a consignment requisition, which is then converted to a consignment PO, and then the ownership transfer and usage of that VMI, vendor managed inventory, raw materials or components takes place. And fourth is the stock transfer kind of consignment, where a group company, which is it could be a financially separate or even financially group of companies under the same umbrella, and here you want a stock transfer from one branch to another branch. So in that case, a requisition is issued for a stock transfer. So generally, if it's especially the same financial component, there is no change of ownership and it's merely a change of location. And we sometimes use this requisition to notify to analyze financial statements, or rather to analyze operations at individual locations. So we have these transfer costs, which are internal costs, and it helps us analyze how each individual facility within a larger financial facility works. And in most cases, the requisitions are transferred to purchasing, who have their own process for approval of these products. But in some cases, especially C class items, you don't want that entire process to happen. So what would happen is, as soon as a requisition is created for a C class items, let's say office supplies, well, in those cases, that requisition could automatically get converted into a purchase order. And then the purchase order, sometimes some suppliers would not even create an invoice, because their dispatch order from the supplier is considered to be good enough to purchase, or good enough to account and pay. But so that's the way these automatic POs could work and make buying for these low price items or C class items very efficient. And we need to understand that requisition is the initiating of the purchasing process. And so it should be absolutely necessary. A user should not be allowed to telephone purchases or talk to suppliers directly and call for materials. Though it happens, that it is done sometimes with organizations, and then the material is the gate, and a post hoc process is created where the PO is created so that the goods at the gate could be let in. But this creates a ton of problems. So, one of the parts of a disciplined organization is that um, all purchases has to initiate with a requisition, and that requisition should be created through the system. Now, what this does is when you force people to create a physical record, it ensures that they have sort of thought through their need, and an honest and a legitimate need is only exercised. So if you make it very easy for users to call up suppliers, well, in some case they could do that, and some material may lie unused. And we all know that that unused material is a lot of money. And organizations, if you scout their material stores, you will see that there is a lot of unused material from 5 years, 10 years lying in some corner and which nobody has even bothered to look at or account for. Third, what it does is it sort of prevents fraud because the user is documented, using function is documented, the budget under which the material is brought is documented, and because the user is in a way disconnected or not directly connected from the supplier, what it does is it creates some kind of a check on the material coming in and avoids fraud. And what it also does, if the requisition process is adequately mapped, if those references or reference codes, requisition codes are adequately designed, it helps us analyze at the end of the year, well, how much of different types of materials were requisitioned by different departments. So, for example, a particular bearing, okay, it may be used by different maintenance functions. Well, which maintenance function are ordered for that bearing? Or office supplies, different functions would want different office supplies. So, if the requisition has that record, again, I don't recommend too much analysis of office supplies. C class items, I have seen businesses indulge in too much excessive analysis of C class. Well, we can create a few graph sheets, templates, but it doesn't save a lot of money. But anyways, the idea is, since requisition tells me where the need originated, I can do some kind of analysis of the different users, their need, how efficiently they use their material. So again, we could have gone into a lot more detail for acquisition, but this should be enough. So remember, this is where the purchase to pay process starts. A purchase requisition created by the user. In the next video, we will talk about step 2.